Dr. Patti Vitt, Director of Natural Resources at the Lake County Forest Preserve District, earned her Ph.D. at the University of Connecticut in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology and her master's at the University of Maine in Botany and Plant Pathology. She served as Senior Scientist and Curator of the Dixon National Tallgrass Prairie Seed Bank at the Chicago Botanic Garden. Joining the Lake County Forest Preserves provided her an opportunity to apply her experience in restoration and to work towards increasing the climate resilience of our area. And so with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Patti Vitt.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation to speak with you all today. And I am primarily going to be speaking about the project at Grant Woods and get into the dirty details, if you will, on some of the science behind how we implemented that program. But first, I just wanted to give a plug for the exhibit, the climate exhibit at the History Museum. It really is quite good. It's very informative, and it's really timely. One of the panels talks about the increase in extreme temperature fluctuations that we are likely to experience. And of course, we have exactly experienced that this week with little doubt. And so I think it's a great exhibit and very timely, and I hope you make an opportunity to go and see it. So I wanted to start really by talking about what we think of when we think of climate resilient restoration. And restoration serves many functions, not just taking maybe a degraded habitat or a converted habitat and attempting to put it back into a native system or a highly functional system. There's lots of things that we are attempting to do when we're undertaking the restoration, and we're hoping that it not only benefits the ecosystems that are providing services, but also the communities, including the human community that is embedded within those ecosystems. Restoration can serve the function of increasing biodiversity. It can certainly increase the function of the ecosystem itself. And by function, I mean things like their natural processes like nutrient cycling and water filtration, as well as pollination, etc. And those services are really important as they function within that ecosystem itself. But when we think of ecosystem services that restoration can provide for us, it's really human benefits that we're kind of enumerating there. And so restoration, it not only increases the resilience of the natural community, but also the human communities within those ecosystems, and certainly can serve as a sustainable attempt at land management. In the end, when we do a restoration, the ultimate goal is to be able to have an ecosystem function more on its own, increasingly on its own, with decreasing human inputs in terms of management activities. Many of our restorations are not there yet, at least here in Lake County, but that's the ultimate goal. And that's what part of what we mean by resilience, is when an ecosystem is resilient to climate or to anything else, that means that it is functioning on its own, providing all of these services, and with decreased human management. So at the Lake County Forest Preserve District, when we think about the management that we do it within this 100-year, very long-term vision. And our strategic planning really sort of focuses on that really long term. And that's really great for restoration because a restoration really can take 20 to 30 years to go from either a degraded system or, maybe an agricultural field into something that is functioning more or less as a native ecosystem. So having a long-term goal is really necessary in order to ensure that it's functioning that way. In the shorter term, we have to have shorter term goals that we're working on that keep us on track for those long-term goals, is to really conserve nature at a really broad scale, just as broadly as we can. And we do that not just by working within our own preserves, but across the county and even with partners outside of the county where that makes sense for us. And we do that because that helps us prevent, species loss. When you're working at that landscape scale, then, your partners and other land owners and managers are also working in concert with your efforts. And we also focus very strongly on data-driven conservation and restoration, which is just so important to ensuring that that our restoration management is actually on track and working to the ends that we're trying to get it to. But our restoration efforts really do need to be informed by climate science. As I mentioned at the beginning, we are already experiencing some of the consequences of global climate change or global warming. And it's going to continue. It's really predicted to continue. We're expecting temperatures between 3 degrees and 5 degrees increase by the end of this century. Increases in winter and spring precipitation. And the patterns of rainfall are going to remain uncertain. And these are really complex challenges. I'd like for you to just take a moment and think about being a seed, right? Just for a minute. If you think about being a seed and you think about what it takes for a seed to determine the right moment to germinate, and you're sensing your environment. The most important things that you're sensing in that environment are moisture levels and temperature. And Tuesday, if you were a seed, the moisture levels and the temperature would have told you that this is a great time to put out some new little seed leaves and start your journey in life. But then the 19-degree temperature that came, within just a few hours would have not been conducive to your continuing that journey. And those kinds of extreme temperature fluctuations, that extreme kind of unpredictability is really at the heart of trying to apply the tenets of climate science and the lessons of climate science to our restoration planning and implementation. So when we think about trying to make a restoration climate resilient, first of all, think about climate resilience. We want to identify and prioritize both the habitat types as well as the individual species that might be the most vulnerable to climate impacts, and focus our management and our conservation efforts on those. And then incorporate climate change projections into restoration planning to try and anticipate future conditions. And that one piece is really, in my opinion, perhaps the most critical piece in trying to make our restorations climate resilient, especially if we are to use the appropriate seed in our restoration. And that's really what I'm going to spend most of the time with, most of our time together with, really kind of keying in on that piece of it. But in addition to trying to anticipate that future, you also have to remain really flexible. And so what we call adaptive management is also really key. Like this winter, we had to pretty much every week, if not every day, try and think, well, what are we going to do today? The ground is frozen. We can do this today. Oh, well, the ground is not frozen, but it's really dry out there. We just have to completely switch gears and start burning, which is exactly what we and lots of other land managers in our region did. Just have to be really flexible and respond to those, sometimes very short-term changes. But then also it is very important to monitor the implementation. Is it working, right? I mean, one key thing that's going to be really interesting to me is to see, well, we burned really early this year. Did that have the intended effect? Did it top kill a lot of weedy species and shrubs that we are trying to control? Or did they escape because they were still dormant? So it's an opportunity to really ask that question about kind of this early season burning. Habitat connectivity is also really important. Species move around, and they're going to move around naturally. And that is a huge piece of ensuring that our habitats are climate resilient. We need to have enough connectivity both within a particular preserve as well as across preserves and other natural areas in our region to ensure that species can move as freely as they need to in order to respond to that changing climate. There's this idea in restoration that as climate continues to change, that we'll move into a time when we won't have analogous ecosystems. And what that means is that right now, when we do a restoration, we have a reference site that tells us this is what this habitat should be. And we're always working to make a new restoration or a new project kind of hit that reference in terms of species and composition and function. But somewhere in the probably not too distant future, we're going to get beyond our ability to use current restoration, current, even remnant sites as our reference site. There's not going to be an analog. And because of that, we're going to be really hard pressed to determine what the correct species composition should be in any given habitat. And we really are going to have to rely on the individual species to assemble as best they can, because they're the ones that are telling us what the right conditions are for them in a particular habitat and place and time. So, and we'll have to monitor that. Again, we go back to sort of the idea of adaptive management. We have to let those species move as they will, and kind of step back and see if it's successful. And then if species can't move freely either within a preserve or across preserves, we might have to do translocation or assisted migration. Assisted migration is this idea that you take a species from one place and you move it to another. And for most people who use this term, they think of assisted migration as taking a species from its native historic range and putting it beyond that historic range. And, that is certainly the extreme of moving species. For me, in a lot of ways, I think restoration is by its nature already a large-scale experiment in translocation or assisted migration, because our preserves can be quite cut off from each other. And when we bring new seed in, that is, essentially an assisted migration. If our habitats were all interconnected, they would be able to move there on their own. But since they're not interconnected, we're moving them in the process of restoring. It's just a question of, it's really just a question of scale and ecological scale more than like geographic scale. And by that, I mean, how far are we moving them in terms of one habitat type to another, as opposed to, are we moving them 5 miles or 10 miles or 20 miles? And this is an important consideration as we move on through the rest of the talk, as I think you'll see. So when you start to work on any restoration project, there are a lot of decisions that you have to make. But when you're trying to ensure that it's going to be climate resilient, the sourcing of your seed is really critical. You're trying to figure out which species, when to put them in the ground. When to put them in the ground is really important. To give you an example of that, many of our species they require an 8 or 12-week period in the winter of really cold temperatures to tell them this is winter, and then when it warms up in 8 to 12 weeks, it's spring and it's okay for you to germinate. And that's kind of our typical, it's called cold stratification, and that's our typical cold stratification window. But as we have seen, that may be changing, and rather radically. For example, just this year, the USDA changed its hardiness zones, and we are now in a zone 6 instead of a zone 5. And so that means that the freezing period has really shrunk quite a bit. And that means that we may have to think about where we're sourcing our seed in terms of, do we need to ensure that they have a shorter cold stratification period than we have been used to using? And that sourcing is the scientific term for that is provenance. And it basically is, where does the seed belong? Where does it come from? Where are you sourcing it from? And it refers to the specific geographic location where the seed or plant material has been collected, if you're collecting from a wild population, or where it's been grown, if you're thinking about a cultivated source. And the reason why this is important is because, all of the environmental characteristics that a plant experiences, the soil, the moisture regime, the temperature regime, all of those things create a particular genetic background of an individual plant. They've evolved, they've been adapted to genetically to that kind of site condition. And really what we're trying to do is to match the genetic adaptation of each species to a particular site when we're choosing seed for a restoration. So understanding where that plant material originated from is how you can make the best choice about where you can apply it in a restoration. And so that is one way of increasing the resilience of a restoration project, is to ensure not only that that match is appropriate for now, but also that it is appropriate kind of moving forward into the future. So here's a couple of different maps that show 2 different ways of strategizing how you do sourcing for a restoration project. The one on the left is the one that is used by Lake County, and the one on the right is the one that's used by Cook County. And neither one is correct or incorrect. They're just pretty different strategies. So the one on the right, the one that's used by Cook County, if you look at that little yellow area, that is where they really prefer to source seed from. They really focus on using seed for restoration that is native, not just to the area, but to Cook County specifically. And they have a very stringent guideline, especially for remnant areas, less for new restoration, but for remnant areas, that they're only going to use seed that originated in Cook County. For a new restoration, they might go and source seed from the broader blue area. And for some, particular projects, they might even go a little bit more broadly to that, the green and the kind of purple areas. But notice that their preference is to source a little further to the south for their restoration projects when they're sourcing outside of that local region. And that's really key, as you'll see as we go along. And if you look at the map on the left, what we do here in Lake County is relatively similar. We're a little further north, so we do tend to source a little bit further north, but we also have a two-tiered system, but we do source much more broadly in general than Cook County does. The circle is centered on the center of Lake County, and we will try and source seeds within a 250-mile radius of the center of Lake County. However, we prefer seed that's in that tier 1, that darker red area, as opposed to tier 2 in that lighter red area. And so we also are really sourcing preferentially to the south of us. And that is primarily because there's sort of a natural inclination to understand that climate is warming, and it's probably better to source more south than north. And this is where I start to get what I'm gonna affectionately refer to as kind of geeky and more technical. And so I'm gonna go through this section, and I am gonna stop, and there are these dark slides. I'm gonna open the floor up to questions, because I really would like for you to make sure that you understand the concepts before I move on. So this is the grand scheme. On this slide, we're showing kind of the grand scheme of sourcing. What we're trying to do is make sure that things are what's called locally adapted, that they're adapted really well to our local environment, that they have a good evolutionary fit. And that square that's entitled local, that would be equivalent to Cook County's tier 1. We're only going to source from Cook County. And then the next box over to the left, the regional, that is really akin to, maybe our tier 1 and Cook County's tier 2. We're going to collect seed, or we're going to use seed from, kind of this regional area. And the problem with that is that many populations that we might source from regionally may be really small. And because they're small, they may not have really broad genetic diversity. Small populations just tend to have less diversity than larger ones. And so if our interest is to make our restorations more climate resilient, what we might want to do is broaden the genetic background of the seeds that we're sourcing from. And so rather than collecting seed from a single population and applying that directly to a restoration site, we might take seed from 2 or 3 or even more populations and kind of maybe mix them together. And that's called admixture sourcing, and you can see that's on the upper left. And that one's really kind of extreme, and you can do it sort of within a region, within a little bit larger region, or really just from wherever. And the idea for that is that we can also try and make our choices match our restoration site more clearly if we understand the climate and how the climate might change. And so, that's what we call predictive provenancing. But it's that trying to predict that is really tricky to do. And so that I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on how you do that, and then how we can apply that in a real restoration project. And kind of the bottom line here is this is exactly what we did in our Grant Woods project here in Lake County. So this approach that I'm going to be talking about does have really good evidence behind it. It's got really good climate modeling behind it, and we didn't just think that this would be a good idea. There's really a lot of research that has gone into doing this exact approach, and it really is trying to incorporate a species habitat and how that habitat in terms of its climate might change over the next 30 to 50 to 80 years. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the niche space or the niche of a species. And a niche is it's really just the environment that a species likes. And, does it like it really wet and warm? Does it like it dry? Does it like a particular soil type, or, does it have a pretty broad niche and it can grow in any kind of soil at all? Each of those can be kind of put into a data set. We think of that as a spatially explicit data set that we might use in what's called a geographic information system. And we would use a temperature map, a precipitation map, a soil map, several other maps, including one that's tries to get at how varied a season might be. There are actually like 19 different climate variables that we can choose from in terms of this niche that we might try and model for any given species. And you do this all the time. You just don't know that you're doing this. If you use a GPS in your car, this is exactly what you're doing. You're using it to navigate from one place to another, but as you have your map up, there's all of this information that is kind of layered on top of the directions that you're following. So there's the map of the area. Layered on top of that is a street map with all the street names and directions, etc. There might be a map of all of the red lights that are there. That's layered on top of that. There might be, another layer that has coffee shops or restaurants or your favorite new clothing store. Each of those is actually, it's a different data set that's layered on top of the map that you're using to navigate from one place to the next. You just don't think of it as different layers in quite the same way, but it's exactly that those GPS maps that we use every day, those model our environment exactly the same way. And so that technology, we're actually much more familiar with it than you might realize. So every point, every place that a plant exists and grows naturally has its own layer of data, all of these different data layers. And what we can do is use information that we know about where plants occur. And we know where plants occur because folks use data systems like iNaturalist and capture location data. There's herbarium records that go back, a couple of 100 years that tell us where plants like to grow and where they grew historically. And so we can take each place that a particular species grows and then layer on top of it all of these other environmental layers, and essentially then kind of cut out and look at the particular environmental niche that that species really likes. And actually the biggest difficulty in using this approach is not the environmental layers, not even knowing where plants are. The biggest difficulty is actually knowing where they are not. So I like to think about the ivory-billed woodpecker. If you are familiar with this bird, it is a rather large woodpecker, somewhat similar to our own pileated woodpecker, but it hasn't been seen in the wild for about 80 or 100 years. However, there are still groups of people who search for this species in Arkansas where there might still be a few individuals of the species. We don't know that that species is actually extinct, just because we haven't seen it. We can't say for certain that it's completely gone. And that negative evidence is really difficult to wrap your brain around. And it's really difficult to try and figure out, when you're trying to figure out if a plant likes a particular type of condition, if you get it wrong because you don't know where a plant is and it could tolerate a certain condition, your modeling won't reflect that certain condition. And so then you're modeling in a much more constrained way than you might otherwise. So that's the biggest difficulty, really, technically, with this particular approach. Okay, that is my last really geeky technical slide. Everything else now builds from that. So I am going to take a little pause and just make sure that that people are with me on this particular idea. So if you have questions or you don't understand, you can either drop something in the chat or you could feel free to just unmute yourself and ask a question.
I have a question, if
Yes.
I may. I understand that one of the challenges with prairie restoration isn't just the plant species, but also the insects necessary to support that ecosystem. So I'm wondering, is that a challenge for you, and how is that being managed?
That is a great question, and it is a definite issue. It's actually harder to manage directly because for the most part, we don't know where a lot of insects are in the same way that we know where a lot of plants and birds and other types of animals are. Just, kind of even regionally, we just don't have lots and lots of data because there are just so many different species that are out there. Monitoring can help, looking at things like seed set and, do we have enough species that are flowering in the spring all the way into the fall in a given restoration. Insects are, they're unlike plants, they move much more readily. And so if there's a population of an insect that remains and they can move to a new site when conditions are right for them to move there, they generally will move on their own. And so that then becomes the cornerstone of our habitat management, is to try and ensure that there are as many plant resources out there for as many insects as possible, and hope that they move in on their own. So that's our goal, to help that. Okay, so I've given you the theoretical background for how to do this particular modeling approach. And now I'm going to move in a little bit into some particulars and talk about one of my favorite species. This is prairie bush clover. The Latin is Lespedeza leptostachya. I fondly refer to it as less lep. It grows in our region in a few places, and it has this really tiny distribution. We don't find it anywhere beyond these few dots that you see on this map. And that makes it actually easy to model. We've looked for this plant. It's so rare that we pretty much know where it is. So we have fewer problems with not knowing where it is. So that means that we can really use this plant as a model for how we might model how climate would affect its distribution. So this is where the plant is known to occur. And you can see where there's a lot of the populations where this plant is found. There's a bright red area around. And where there's no populations or only a few populations, it goes from red to orange to a darker yellow to a lighter yellow to blue to finally white, where it just isn't going to occur. The climate in particular is not conducive to this species at all. And that's really what I've got, that's what's modeled right here. It is really just the climate that this plant will grow in. And that's called its climate envelope. And so I'm just going to walk through 4 slides. They're 4 time step slides where we take the climate that was known in 2000, and I know it's beyond 2020, but I did this work a long time ago. So the next time step is 2020. And what's really remarkable about this is that when I did this modeling, we were predicted to have cold, wet springs, which doesn't seem like that's climate change, because we all think climate change is just about, everything's getting warmer. But in 2020, the climate models predicted that we were going to have these cold, wet springs. And that's exactly what happened, particularly in the area in Illinois where this species occurs. And it was really, really noticeable. And so that gave me a lot of confidence that maybe this modeling approach was pretty good. So I'm gonna go back. There's 2020. There's 2023, and you can already see that the populations in Illinois are kind of just getting to the maybe not so good part of the climate envelope of this species as the climate is changing around those locations. And then as we move to 2050, it's a big jump. It's still kind of light blue in Illinois, very barely light blue in Illinois. And for the most part, the climate has kind of migrated north into Minnesota and northern Wisconsin. And that is even more extreme by 2080. So the climate prediction for this species really means that those southern populations are going to be pretty far outside of the climate envelope if the climate projections kind of move the way we think they are going to. And the arrow, what I've done with this arrow is to the big circle is literally the center of the population and the climate in 2000. And then the arrow, both the direction and where it stops, is the center of the climate that this plant likes in 2080. And so we can use that, the direction and the distance of that arrow to give us an idea of how far this species climate moves and how far kind of its preferred climate condition is projected to move. And where we might think, if we were going to do something like assisted migration for this species, where we would think about looking for habitat. So we did this for a bunch of different species, both in the Western United States and in the Eastern United States. And you can see there's really different patterns, all those circles going around everywhere, although the arrows everywhere in the West. Whereas in the East, there's a real pattern here. In general, our species are predicted to move pretty much from the south to the northeast. A few move different directions, but for the most part, the general pattern is that our eastern species are more likely to move north and east, whereas the western species, they're moving kind of everywhere. And that makes sense, especially if you realize that a lot of them are modeled pretty much either in the Intermountain Basin or actually, within different mountain ranges. So you could, they're really much harder to predict than our species here, kind of in these beautiful grasslands that we know and love. So I did the same approach for common species, including big bluestem, which is a really important component for a lot of restoration. And I'm just going to walk quickly through this. Now that you kind of get the understanding of what we're doing and why. And this is the current range for big bluestem. This is its predicted range for 2050. Not a real big change. And so then I did a little bit more specifically the same kind of modeling. I wanted to know, what is the Illinois population, going to do? And where should we source seeds from now and into the future? If we're thinking about, in 50 years, our population might need some assisted migration. So this is the current climate model for big bluestem for Illinois in particular. And then this is how the future climate would look for big bluestem just for Illinois. And here's the same thing. I'm using the arrow in basically the exact same way. The center of the climate model in Missouri now versus what it should be in 2050, or what it is predicted to be in 2050. And so I'm using this as a way to gauge, well, in 2050, our climate is basically going to be very similar to the climate in Missouri. And so maybe that's where we should be looking to source seed from, is Missouri. And for big bluestem, it's kind of interesting. The climate models indicate that the range is going to really expand as opposed to shift completely. And the place where we want to restore is within both the current and historical, as well as the projected range for using these climate models. It's really widespread, it's wind pollinated, etc. And so the idea from these models is that maybe local seed is probably just fine, maybe mixed with some seed from Missouri to increase its genetic diversity, particularly with the genetic diversity of Missouri, just to give it that little bit of southern taste, if you will. I did something really similar with another very common species in restoration, bee balm. Exactly the same approach. So, and then you see it is pretty much the exact same result. We see a shift from, the climate currently from Missouri to northern Illinois by 2050. So basically that's saying, yeah, this kind of northeast movement of the climate is telling us many of the same species in our area are likely to have the same pattern as the other rare species do. And that's actually pretty interesting because, we get a lot of evidence from a lot of different sources that's telling us the same thing. And so that can increase our confidence to know that maybe sourcing from Missouri, now and over the next few decades might be a good strategy to make our restorations more climate resilient into the future. So bee balm is a little bit different because it's not wind pollinated. It has a little bit smaller range, and actually it is going to have a shift it's actually going to contract at the southern edge as opposed to just kind of expand. So it's kind of moving. The whole climate envelopes for this species is moving a little bit north. And so much like the West Lep or the prairie bush plover envelope did. And so it may mean that, in 2050, bee balm won't really do very well in Missouri if it doesn't adapt in place over that same time. So for this species, the idea might be we would source from Missouri with composite provenance as a pilot to try and understand how or if that's a good strategy now. But we might do it again in 10 years or 15 years to see, well, maybe there's a better match now. So this is not a one and done kind of approach. You have to think about it kind of stepping stone, both through geographic space as the climate is shifting across that geographic space. But also it's kind of a stepping stone in time as well, because, climate change is happening, but it's going to continue to happen. And so we need to apply the tenets of adaptive management really carefully across this whole time frame to make sure that we're sourcing correctly, et cetera. And I just want to point out, the bottom picture is our project area at Grant Woods, and the top picture is our reference site out at Mechusa Grasslands in Franklin Grove, Illinois. And then, so you might be asking yourself, and rightly so, was this approach, is it successful? And, truthfully, I'm not focusing, because our time is almost out. I'm not focusing on the success of this project and the outcome, because I don't really know what the outcome is yet. And I'll tell you quite honestly, the first year that we seeded in the project, what we did was we had a very small area that we sourced using this strategy from the south, and then a much larger area that we used our standard sourcing techniques that I showed you in our tier 1, tier 2 map. And that first year, that was the year after we put the seed down, that was the year of the really terrible drought. And truthfully, we had very little success, regardless of whether the seed came using our southern sourcing strategy or our standard sourcing strategy. And so we had to reseed both sites, both areas completely, which was really, it was both disappointing, but it was also, it was exactly the point. Our seasons are becoming much more unpredictable, and we might have sourced seed from the right places, but we certainly didn't put them down at the right time. And it's hard to know exactly when the right time is. We have reseeded both of the areas. We will continue to reseed them in the hopes that, that we'll get a better outcome, at least in terms of seed germination. I can say that we did have enough grasses come up over the last couple of years that we had our first successful burn of this project area just this week, which means that there was enough native grasses that grew in place to have a nice fuel load to carry the fire. It burned really well. And so that's the first sign of any success across this project area. And we'll continue to monitor the site and see, which species came up where, how they responded to kind of our weird winter and our early winter burning. So really, most of the lessons that we've learned so far in this project have to do with sourcing. And that's not nothing. We all hope for a spectacular, quick outcome, but that's just not the way that restoration works. It's it's a 20 to 30 year time frame before we really know we've done something really, really correctly. So if you want to go local, maybe consider expanding the radius of your collection. It seems like using different strategies for different species, especially as our climate continues to change, may be the best approach. And it could be based on both the geographic range, the mating system, their life history, as well as any climate projections for that individual species, because they are different for different species. When you are buying seed, founder size and where the seed originated, as opposed to just where it's being grown, could be really important for helping you understand kind of where to, whether or not you have a good match. So I hope you've learned a lot about seed sourcing and how to make restoration, how we try and make our restorations more climate resilient. In a lot of ways, we're clearly not doing this for us. We're doing it for everybody who enjoys the aesthetics, enjoys the services that those resilient ecosystems provide now and will provide into our collective future. So I just want to say thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure putting this talk together for you. And I am really happy to answer any questions that you might have at this point.
Thank you so much, Patty, for that presentation. So, yep, just like we said, if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask, feel free to unmute yourself or type them in the chat. And we do have one right off the bat here from Kathleen, who asks, we know that soil-dwelling insects can be sensitive to soil temperatures and soil moisture regimes. How will they be affected as the climate shifts? And are there any plans out there to help them, such as through assisted migration?
Yeah, insects are really hard because we know very little about the individual species and even where they occur. We know more about guilds, especially for a lot of pollinators. And we do know that ground nesting species can be really sensitive. Unless we can rear them or otherwise collect them, assisting in their migration is going to prove really tricky. So the best that I think we can do is to ensure that they hang around in our natural areas and then provide the best circumstances, the best habitat, the best management for them, and again, provide that there's more connectivity between habitats, and that will help them move on their own. They can move on their own a lot easier than a lot of plants can. And there may be a few insects that are either critically important, that we know a lot about, or that are really iconic, that we might end up doing some kind of species conservation program. Monarchs come to mind. They're not ground nesting, but they are certainly in trouble. I don't know what the correct conservation actions are for them in terms of intervention, making our habitats really provide a lot of flowering resources and a lot of milkweeds in particular for them to lay their eggs on really broadly across the range that they have. That's what we can do as individuals. And then hopefully there's some entomologists who are really thinking about, if there are management interventions or other species conservation type interventions that might be necessary. I'm sure they are thinking about it.
While we wait for a few more questions, Patty, I actually had a question that I'd like to get your thoughts on. When you showed us that chart with the diversity, land adaptation, and climate resilience, I thought it was such a great example of the complexity, but also really important nature of the work that you all are doing. I wanted to ask, is that chart something that is recognized nationwide or perhaps even worldwide as kind of the structure for approaching a problem like this? Or is it adapted at all for different biomes, for different geographic regions at all?
Yeah, it actually, you're talking about the colorful one where there's like the
Exactly
genetic
right. Yeah.
diversity, and yeah, it actually, it comes from, we kind of adapted it, but it comes from, originally from a paper, from a research group out of Germany. And they've talked about the different, kind of strategies for mixing seed. And they've done a lot of research in Germany to try and figure out, more the geographic boundaries. So, and there's also a group in Australia that is doing something very similar. So the answer is yes. Each geographic region, each ecological region, if you will, kind of has to work on the problem individually, and regionally, because the soils and the climate really are just that local. But overall, the approach is really broadly accepted. We just don't, there's just not a lot of research yet. Well, there's a lot of research, but there's not a lot of research, that's actually been published yet, because it's just this really long-term stuff. And where there is a lot of work that's been done that is published that we know a lot about, is trees. So the people who work on trees kind of started this kind of work, a few decades before we all did, in terms of restoration. And so a lot of what we know, are some of the things that we have to watch out for. We know more for trees than we do for prairie species. And that's really why this kind of demonstration project is really so important, because the science that we're using is really sound, but there's always unintended consequences, and what the outcomes really are on the ground just haven't really been, there just haven't been a lot of projects like this to tell us, um, to allow us to fine tune it and refine the approach.
Yeah, I think a good lead-in from that question, regarding what we know and what we don't know, have Lake County Forest Preserves, or maybe you personally, have you heard any feedback from the community after you've conducted restoration projects like this? Have you heard about any kind of local engagement that people have done to try and, do this work on their own individually or within local communities themselves?
I not in this region. It is really, interesting, especially in Lake County. We have a really active group of volunteers, but we're primarily providing seed for them. They might exchange seed, across preserves, etc. But more broadly, yes. So, one example that really comes to mind when you ask that question is in Colorado, where there is a very broad kind of seed exchange, across a pretty broad region. I mean, it kind of makes sense, because of the mountainous terrain and some of the intermountain. We saw how unpredictable, the movement of plants is likely to be in that type of region. And so, I think they're a little bit more proactive, and maybe, have a little bit, are more tolerant of risk. I think that's really what it comes down to. They're more tolerant of risk. And so they're maybe doing a little bit more experimental approaches than we are here. And either approach is, I'm not making any judgment. But here, I think, you could make the argument that plants they're short enough lived. Most of our major restoration species are short enough lived that if we only give them climate to respond to, that they'll adapt in place pretty quickly. And there's some evidence that that's true, but also some that's a little bit maybe not, we maybe need to be a little bit more proactive. So I, and maybe in a few years when we have more definitive evidence, we ourselves would expand the approach, if we find it to be a good one. But, maybe we're being a little cautious as well, and probably rightly so.
Well, while we wait for maybe one or two more questions before we adjourn for this evening, Dr. Pati Vitt, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon and for sharing this information. I wanted to remind everybody that this program will be available free of charge on our YouTube channel. So if you would like to revisit it, or please share it at your leisure, they're completely free. We highly recommend you do that. The recording will be on our main YouTube channel hopefully next week. And once again, I wanted to reiterate that our exhibit that this program was in supplementation of 4 degrees of difference from glaciers to global warming is now available to view, and will be available to view through May 11th of this year. So if you have the time, we highly recommend you come and enjoy it. And I also wanted to mention that virtual programming at the History Center continues to be made possible by the generous support of Madeline Dugan and Mark Saran. So thank you, both of you, for continuing to support our virtual programming sessions. So once again, Dr. Vitt, thank you so much for joining with us, and thank you all for attending this afternoon.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciated and enjoyed it very much.